Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the absolute magic and the hard science behind high performance and intense focus. We're pulling this straight from the incredible work of Dr. Andrew Huberman, a Stanford neurobiology professor. We're going to look at the literal, mechanical ways your brain changes itself, and more importantly, how you can actually grab the steering wheel of that biological machinery. But hey, before we dive into the heavy science, we really need to talk about where Dr. Huberman actually started. Because before he was this world-renowned Stanford scientist, he was, as he puts it, a totally feral teenager. Think about that. He was skipping school, obsessed with skateboarding, roaming the streets of San Francisco without any real supervision, and he eventually wound up in a locked psychological facility. His life isn't just an interesting story. It's a living, breathing testament to the brain's massive capacity to completely rewire itself. Section 1. Rewiring the Feral Mind. From punk rock truant to Stanford professor. So let's dive into this origin story, right? Looking at his trajectory, this is a kid who seemed completely destined to fall through the cracks. At age 13, his parents split up, which led to heavy truancy and just spending his days underground skateboarding. By his mid-teens, he's placed in a locked facility with other struggling youth. But then, right around age 20, staring down a pretty bleak future, he makes a hard pivot. He decides to completely overhaul his life and pursue academics. And get this, he didn't do it because of some sudden, deep love for learning. He did it out of pure, unadulterated fear of where his life was headed. He basically built his own strict structure out of nothing, forcing himself to sit in a chair and study until a timer went off. By pushing through that intense, awful agitation, he managed to tap into the exact biological machinery of neuroplasticity that every single one of us has sitting right there in our heads. Section 2. The mechanics of neuroplasticity. How the adult brain changes itself. So how exactly did he change his brain? Well, first, we've got to understand the playing field. Our nervous system basically manages 5 key things: sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and behavior. Literally all day long, your nervous system is in this constant dynamic dance, trying to match what's going on inside you with the demands of the outside world. Sensation brings in the raw data. Perception is the spotlight, what you're actually choosing to pay attention to. Feelings link those physical sensations in your body to mental concepts. Thoughts? Well, they just pop up, kind of like having 50 browser tabs open when you're trying to work. And finally, behavior is the actual action you take. And that brings us to neuroplasticity. We hear this buzzword thrown around all the time, but fundamentally, it's just the brain's built-in mechanism for upgrading its own algorithms to handle new challenges. Up until you're about 25, your brain is super malleable. It absorbs languages and skills almost passively, like a sponge. But in adulthood, it's a different story. If you want to change your adult brain, you have to actively force it to rewire. Honestly, your brain doesn't want to change its comfortable established patterns. You have to give it a deeply biological reason to do so. Now, here's a massive misconception. Most people think you rewire your brain while you're actively learning or practicing. Actually, that is biologically incorrect. Intense focus merely triggers the plasticity. It basically flags specific neurons and says, hey, heads up, we're going to need to change these. But the actual physical rewiring, the strengthening of those neural circuits, that entirely happens while we are in deep rest or completely asleep. So you trigger the change with focus, but you actually build the change with sleep. Pretty wild, right? Section 3. The chemistry of focus. Agitation as the gateway to learning. Let's look at the specific neurochemical cocktail that makes all this possible. When you sit down to learn something difficult, like Huberman forcing himself to study, your brain releases a chemical called norepinephrine. Think of it as adrenaline for the brain. It wakes you up and gives you alertness. Then it releases acetylcholine, which acts as this incredibly sharp spotlight of attention, tagging the exact neural circuits that need to adapt. But here's the secret that trips almost everyone up. The combination of these two chemicals, it feels terrible. It feels like stress, frustration, and intense agitation. We've been sold this idea that if we aren't in some blissful flow state, we're doing it wrong. But the science shows us that agitation is the mandatory biological gateway to high-level focus. You literally have to wade through that friction to get to the learning. The catch is, you can only tolerate that high adrenaline agitation for so long before your brain just screams at you to quit. And this is exactly where dopamine comes to the rescue. Now, pop culture tells us dopamine is just a cheap thrill from scrolling social media or eating junk food. But biologically, it is a critical milestone neurochemical. When you achieve a tiny goal, or honestly, even just realize you're on the right path, your brain releases dopamine, and its absolute superpower is that it actively suppresses that overwhelming adrenaline. It pushes the agitation down, granting you the extra energy and the permission to just keep pushing forward without giving up. But you've got to be careful here. If you tether your dopamine to external rewards like money, praise, or, gold stars, you will eventually exhaust your motivation entirely. There's this famous Stanford study where kids who genuinely love drawing were given gold stars for their pictures. But when the stars stopped coming, the kids stopped drawing. They had outsourced their dopamine. To achieve sustained high performance, you absolutely must attach your dopamine to internal milestones and to the effort process itself. If you can learn to self-reward the friction of just being on the right path, you essentially unlock an infinite source of focus and energy. Section 4. Your autonomic control panel, using the body to steer the mind. Okay, so all of this internal chemistry sounds amazing in theory, but how can you manually hack these chemicals in real time when you're just feeling totally overwhelmed? Well, the answer is sitting right there in your anatomy. You can't consciously control your heart rate just by thinking about it. You can't control your liver or your spleen, but you can control your diaphragm. It's the only internal organ designed as a skeletal muscle specifically so you can voluntarily control it. It is your manual override switch. By intentionally moving your diaphragm, you can instantly dictate to your brain exactly how it should feel and successfully manage incoming stress. And the absolute best way to use this override switch is a scientifically proven technique called the physiological sigh. So if you're feeling stressed or your mind is just racing, here's what you do. You take 2 sharp inhales through the nose, followed by 1 extended, slow exhale through the mouth. That double inhale pops open these little sacs in your lungs, pulling carbon dioxide out of your bloodstream. And then the long exhale maximally offloads that carbon dioxide, acting as a rapid, real-time brake on your nervous system. You don't need a full hour of meditation on a cushion. Just 1 to 3 of these sighs will immediately calm you down. It's like magic, but it's biology. You can also use your eyes to steer your mind. Your visual system is deeply tied to your autonomic arousal. Staring intensely at a single point, which we call focal vision, is basically like putting your brain in portrait mode. It dilates your pupils, releases adrenaline, and triggers cognitive focus and alertness. But if you're exhausted and you need a break, you can switch to panoramic vision. Just by relaxing your gaze to the horizon and taking in your periphery, you literally turn off the brainstem's stress circuit. It alters your perception of time and recovers your energy. It gives you a micro recovery without ever having to even close your eyes. Section 5. Behavior first, mood follows. The biological sequence of real change. So how do we overcome that massive mental friction of just getting started when we feel zero motivation? Most of us try to change our thoughts to change our behavior. We wait around until we feel like doing something, or we try to mentally negotiate with our anxiety. But neuroscience proves that this is entirely backward. Trying to control the mind with the mind is a losing game. You must shift your behavior first. Action has to take the lead. Once you physically move your body into the behavior, seconds later your thoughts align. Minutes later your feelings catch up, and eventually your entire perception of the whole event shifts. This is exactly how you overcome fear through action. When you're facing a threat, physical or emotional, freezing or retreating actually blocks your internal reward system. But physically moving forward into the friction, that triggers the exact dopamine circuitry we talked about earlier. It rewards the action and sets you up for future success. In fact, high agitation is often biologically required to force us out of our comfort zones. This is why strict deadlines, and yes, even fear, like a 20-year-old Andrew Huberman completely terrified of his future, are so incredibly effective. They raise the agitation high enough to force forward movement. As Dr. Huberman noted when studying highly resilient people, like Navy SEALs or ultra-endurance athletes like David Goggins, they don't have some magical feel-good neurochemistry. They just understand the sequence. They plunge into the discomfort first. They use physical behavior as the lever to force their brain's neurochemistry to adapt. They use behavior to shift sensation, perception, feelings, and thoughts. They act first, and they absolutely trust that the mood, the dopamine, and the focus will inevitably follow. So we've seen the blueprint, right? We know that intense focus and agitation mark the brain for change, and that deep rest anchors that rewiring. We know that forward action releases the dopamine required to keep going, knowing that neuroplasticity is driven by your actions, not your thoughts, and anchored by your sleep. What small, immediate behavior will you execute today to build a better brain tonight? Thanks for hanging out with me in this explainer, and I really hope this empowers you to take the wheel of your own biology.